Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on using collaborative math teams in your math class. My name is Nikki Lynham. I am a teacher in the Greater Victoria School District, as well as co-founder of Educating Now. And one of the best parts about my job is that I get to work with lots of different teachers and try out best practices and things that I read about in research. And one of those things was using these collaborative teams. So over the course of about 2 years, I tried this many different ways and had a lot of somewhat successes and really a lot of failures, and finally figured out a way of doing it that worked in multiple different classrooms with different grade levels. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So today's webinar is really an overview. We do have a full course, which is a 12-part course that would give you all the information and resources you need to get these up and running in your classroom, no matter what grade you're teaching. And we'll be giving you a special offer for that course, and I'll be referring to it as we go. I also want to introduce our moderator. His name is Lou, and he will be moderating the chat. So if you have questions throughout, please write them in, and Lou will interrupt me every so often and ask those questions. So I'm just going to make sure our tech is working. Hey, Lou, can you hear me?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm here.
Great. So with that, we will get started. I'm going to screen share this PowerPoint with you, and you will have access to this. We'll be sending you a playback link tomorrow with a special offer for our course, as well as you will have access to this PowerPoint in that same link. Okay, so first thing I wanted to share with you is that, sorry, I just want to make sure I've got this to everybody. Okay, I think we're good now. So the books that I used for this for these collaborative math teams were these two books primarily. I certainly read a lot of different articles, but most of the information that I gleaned was from these two books. I highly recommend both of them, especially Jo Boaler's book, Mathematical Mindsets, partly because it's only 20 bucks and it is well worth every penny of that. And it gives a really nice overview of just teaching math in general and how it's shifting due to the changing needs of what our students actually need when they graduate school. And Math Expressions is published by Pearson. It has a lot of great companion resources online, so you can check that out. And I also found it really valuable. And it actually talks more about communication in multiple different ways. So not just in group work, but in how to teach kids how to write and speak in math class. So those two resources really helped me out a lot. Let's take a look at what we're going to be going over in this webinar. So first, we're going to be looking at the benefits of using the collaborative math teams, both for students and for you as teachers. Next, we're going to look at how to set up the teams so that every student is engaged and held accountable. That's one of the ways in which this works so well. We're going to look at a specific example of a task that I did in a grade 8 class, and how the students worked in their teams with that task, as well as when we needed to use some direct instruction to intervene when they were struggling. And finally, I'm going to be showing you some ways and explaining how using these teams helps to differentiate your math class so that you're meeting more of your learners' needs. So let's start with the benefits for students. First off, every single teacher that I was working with using the collaborative teams, when I asked them, what are you noticing in your class while using the teams that's different from when you were teaching before? And each of them said, firstly, student engagement went through the roof. And this was for all students. And I would like to say I noticed especially the struggling learners. So those kids that sometimes they opt out really visibly by putting their head down on the table, or just goofing around or having behavior issues. And other times, though, these are the students that look as though they're paying attention, but the minute that they're asked to do something on their own, they put their hand up and need help because they haven't really been with you or paying attention. And I saw that those students benefited absolutely, incredibly with this method. So student engagement was huge. We also noticed that the problem-solving skills improved dramatically. Their ability to critical think in terms of checking for reasonableness, analyzing other people's solutions and seeing if they could make sense of them. Their ability to communicate, again, surpassed my expectations. One of my colleagues came in to watch a couple of lessons because he was interested in trying it out. And that was one of the things he noticed. He was blown away by how well the students could communicate their ideas mathematically. Their ability to collaborate improved dramatically, and they were a lot more creative in how they approach math. And math has often, gotten a bad rap for being a very, not having no creativity. But when we explore problem solving the way we do in these teams, which allows for an element of inquiry, we get a lot of creativity, and it was really great to see that. We also saw a lot less frustration and waiting for the teacher to help. And I don't know, this always just reminds me, if you've had a similar experience to me, but my math classes used to be incredibly exhausting, because what would happen is we'd use the manipulatives and models, and we'd use our individual whiteboards and work through problems together. And once I figured most of the students had a good conceptual understanding of what we were getting at, I'd give them their task or practice work to do. And immediately I would have 6 or 7 kids that would put up their hand and need help right away. And before I could even get through helping all of those students, you would have other students that needed help along the way, and then you'd have a whole group of students that were done. And I sort of was just running around like a mad woman trying to meet all their needs and not feeling like I was really able to do so. And at the end of it, I was exhausted. I was frustrated because I didn't feel like I could get to all the kids who needed me. And this is what I loved the most about these teams, is all of that is completely eliminated. It's not even just lessened, it's gone. And students are able to help each other, and the ones that need the help and that one-on-one support, and we all have those kids in our class, they get that one-on-one help throughout the lesson. It's just not you helping them, it's their peers. We noticed that they developed much stronger conceptual understanding of math concepts, and they weren't memorizing procedures. And in some cases, depending on the concept, they weren't even learning procedures formally. They were creating their own procedures based on what made sense mathematically in the context, which was pretty amazing to see. And so what we do when we work with these teams is we don't just solve math, in that traditional way of just using a procedure. Instead, we are interacting with all of these pieces you see here. So we use manipulatives, that's the concrete. We make models and represent the mathematics using those. We also use pictorial representations and models, things like number lines and area models. And we use verbal, we explain our reasoning, and we put the math into context or talk about it in context. And then the symbolic, that's what we're kind of more used to with math. That's just using our math symbols and numbers. Here are some student testimonials. So these are all from a grade 8 class, and this is what they said when we asked them for feedback on using the math teams. Hearing other people's concepts and ideas helped me understand, said Garrett. Olivia said, I think it built a better understanding for me by explaining it to my group in different ways and helping them understand. And Olivia she was a student who was actually quite strong, especially procedurally. And at first I was a little bit worried about her and her group, because she had a group where there was 2 kind of struggling learners in there. And I thought, I want to make sure she was adequately challenged as well. And she absolutely was challenged. And what her challenge ended up being was that most of the time her peers couldn't understand her procedure. And because she didn't have great conceptual understanding all the time, she couldn't explain it, the procedure, why it made sense. And so instead, she had to find different ways of solving the problem, often visually or just in another procedure that made more sense. And so she grew a much stronger conceptual understanding as she was working towards teaching her peers. So she was very challenged and certainly developed a way stronger conceptual understanding in all of the concepts. Kylie said, I can learn the same thing in multiple different ways because my classmates and I all do things differently. Also, if I don't understand someone's explanation, I can try and understand someone else's. And I love this quote because it shows partly the culture that we built in that class, which I'll get into as we go along here, but they really valued diversity and they liked learning other people's ways of doing the math. I actually honestly thought they would kind of moan and groan a little bit, like if they could do it one way, they were fine with it, but they liked and they found it really interesting that there were multiple different ways of solving the same problem. Heyman said it helped me to see different ways of doing the questions. Also, it made me think and understand different ways of thinking mathematically. And Kyla said, I liked groups because if I don't understand how the teacher teaches, I can ask my group members. And again, I've been saying this for years. We need to allow our students the opportunity to explain their thinking because oftentimes their peers have a way easier time understanding their thinking than they do the teacher's explanation. So it gives them a chance to shine and to show their understanding, as well as I think it helps the other students almost better. We also, with the same feedback, we asked the students, would you prefer to continue working in math groups? That's what we called them. Or do we want to go back to the more kind of traditional teacher-directed style, which when I say that, I don't mean just procedural. We were definitely more teacher-directed in that we were leading the whole class together, but we were still using models and manipulatives and partner talk and all the rest of it. But 100% of the students chose the math groups. And in that class of 30, only one student, she actually chose both. And we asked them to give a reason for their choice. They couldn't just tick a box. And she said the reason she chose both was she did not like having to talk out loud. And so the groups really challenged her. But I think it was great because she needed to kind of get out of her shell a little bit. And she had some really great ways of doing things that were really useful to her group members. So now let's talk about benefits for teachers. So first of all, the major thing that we noticed is that there is way more time for formative assessment, which allows you to really have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the class. So like the story I was telling you before, the students aren't all putting their hand up and asking the same question, which we know happens all the time, even when we address that question with the whole class. And part of the way the teams work this way is that only one person in the team is allowed to ask the teacher for help, and they're only allowed to ask if no one else in the group can solve that problem or answer the question. And so that dramatically reduced almost, and after a few weeks, almost eliminated the need for even asking the teacher questions at all, which gives you a chance to go around, work with students one-on-one, support the groups where you see is needed, and just really have a better grasp of what they're understanding and what they're not, so that you can adjust your teaching to meet their needs. It really allows you the opportunity to be responsive to your students' needs. If you are a teacher in British Columbia, like myself, then the other huge benefit for you is going to be that these teams utilize all of the curricular competencies in math. So you are teaching the content interlocked with the competencies, which is how the curriculum is designed, and the teams do this in an amazing way, especially with the multiple representations and the visualizing, because we ensure that they're doing math visually as well as procedurally, and they're able to communicate their understanding. And we know that students better engage in mathematical reasoning when they're doing it out loud, rather than just thinking about it silently. I also heard from my colleagues that they were more inspired and a whole lot less exhausted at the end of the lessons. And again, that comes back to you're not running around putting out fires. You are able to actually some time and go around and listen and pay attention to your learners. And it's pretty powerful to watch these students totally engaged. And that's the other thing I know from speaking from my own experience. No matter what I did, I always felt like there was a few students that weren't with me, if you know what I mean, in my class. And using these teams, that was gone because we kind of utilize peer pressure in a positive way to ensure that they are all held accountable, which means they're all engaged. Dom is a grade 6 teacher, and he said that it was the kids driving the process. They were driving their learning in a very collaborative way. It empowers the kids, it's student-centered, they're communicating their understanding at a far greater level than just me at the front of the class just choosing students. So he's referring to, you know, when we ask students questions, we often have a smattering of them putting up their hands, but we're not getting to hear from all of them, and we just don't have time to hear from all of them. But when they're in their teams, they all are held accountable for stating their understanding. So they are forced to actually engage in the lesson in that way. And he reiterated that it allowed him to go from group to group and really do a better job of assessing the needs of his students. Arlene is a grade 8 teacher, and she has said that collaborative math teams has changed my practice. I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I'm going to do this method of teaching for all my units. And she is doing this, and she doesn't just teach math, she teaches other curricular areas. And she is using these collaborative teams as a way of operating in her classroom with her students. It was that powerful. She said, I don't see kids frustrated, and my math class was less exhausting, and she felt like she was delivering what she needed to them in a more effective way. And again, that comes back to that formative assessment. If you're able to know what the students' needs are in real time, rather than the traditional way of, you know, having a quiz or marking homework, it's too late by the time you get to review that work to address the misunderstandings. You have to wait until the next class, which is not ideal. This way, you're able to respond in real time, and it's super effective. So the overview of getting started here, I'm going to talk about each of these in a bit more detail coming up. And I want to reiterate that our course on Educating Now goes into way more detail. But as I'm going through this, if you have some specific questions, again, please feel free to add them into the chat, and Lou will jump in and ask me those questions. So the first thing we need to do is talk about planning your teams, and actually have a bit of new information for you on that, because I'm working with a whole bunch of teachers right now doing this in our classrooms. We're going to talk about how we lay out those expectations and how we incorporate the reflection and feedback process, which helps to ensure that the students are working collaboratively and effectively. So let's start with setting up the teams. There are a number of different ways of doing this. If you read in Jo Boaler's book, Mathematical Mindsets, she talks about a way of teaching called complex instruction. I hate the name because it makes it sound difficult, and it's not. But it's a really interesting way of setting up the teams and the roles. And what it is actually designed to do is to create equity in the classroom. And I saw that in effect. And in that design, and you're going to hear me refer to complex instruction again, because a lot of what I did incorporate all the elements of complex instruction. They use 4 students per team. Now in Math Expressions, you will see that they have roles for between 3 and 6 students per team. I personally liked 4. I found that the best, but some of my colleagues preferred to have different numbers. So you'll need to make that decision. But what you'll want to do is ensure that each of the groups has mixed ability and mixed skills. So we are not grouping according to ability. That's actually the complete opposite of what we want to do. And what we found the most successful was in each group to make sure that there is one student who is a strong communicator. We wanted one student who was pretty strong procedurally with math, one that we thought was strong conceptually, and the 4th was a student that just didn't show any of those strengths yet. And right now, I'm in the process of helping teachers do this in their classrooms, and the trouble is we don't really know our students that well yet. But we know them well enough at least to pick out some good communicators. We've done enough activities with them over the past week and a half, almost 2 weeks now, where students, are demonstrating their abilities. And one of the things that we've done is we have used the mindset diagnostic, which you would find in our course, to identify the students that have growth or fixed mindsets. And I'm going to talk about this later, but we're using that to help us make teams. So there's lots of different ways you can construct your teams. If you are jumping right into this right now and you don't know your students that well, my suggestion is either talk to previous teachers, take a look at their files. You could give them a pre-assessment so that you have some sense of where their strengths are. But again, make sure you have at least a strong communicator in each team. Now, the way that makes this work, now I will tell you that I did not enjoy group work when I was in school or university even, really, because oftentimes you'd have 1 or 2 people doing all the work and the rest weren't really pulling their weight. And as a teacher, I saw the same thing when I would do group work. So what makes this different is that we're being extremely specific about how we're setting it up. And part of that is that each student has a responsibility. So there are 4 roles, and they will change roles. They have an opportunity to try different roles, but they each have their own responsibilities. And that way, every student is held accountable because the rest of their team needs them to perform their roles. And again, I give you all these roles in the course and go into more detail. If you want to ask questions about that, please feel free to jump in. Now, the other aspect that, and this is part of the complex instruction that's really crucial, is that each member of the team is accountable not just for their own learning, but also for each other's learning. And we hold them accountable to that by going around and checking in with them. And this was something that when I didn't do, it made a really big difference. When I did do it, it slowed the whole process down, and the students really did do a good job of making sure that everyone got it. That way, no one was slipping between the cracks. There was no one that was just sitting there pretending to get it. It wasn't really, there was no opportunity for that. So they were all engaged and learning. So as we move forward with this, the real first step before we get into any math, after we've got our groups, is we need to build a math culture. And a couple of ways we start with that. First, we co-create criteria for both problem solving and collaborative learning. Now, co-creating means that with the students, they are the ones who are going to be using these teams, and really we're doing all of this for their learning opportunity. So they need to be involved in creating criteria. And I do give you a rubric in the course that is from Math Expressions. You could look it up yourself too. And it's a really nice rubric for the collaborative learning and what's important for the students. So this is their opportunity to really share with their peers and with us what they need in order to learn well together. And then we create a big kind of rubric that goes up as a poster, and we refer to that often because we're going to need to remind them over and over again, what does collaborative learning look like? Because students do not come to us prepared to do this at all. It is something we need to explicitly teach. We also need to explicitly teach what effective problem solving looks like. And students need to be involved in that as well. So that's how we start, is we start creating these criteria with the students so that they have very clear understanding of what our expectations are and what their learning goals are. Next, we move into teaching about the growth mindset. And this is, if you don't know what the growth and fixed mindset are, please look it up. It's so valuable for any educator and really just as a person in general, I think. But it's crucial, I think, if you're an educator. And the research on this, there's a lot of new research. And I certainly didn't learn about this in my teacher training 16 years ago. So it's really important to stay relevant, especially with the new technology gives us a lot more insight into the neuroscience and can inform our practices a lot more. So I'm going to give you just a quick, Carol Dweck, really, she's the professor at Stanford that has researched and written about this extensively. There are a ton of free resources online. This I think I got from Pinterest. In a nutshell, if you have a growth mindset, it means that you know that your effort and your attitude are more important than your born ability or inherent ability. You also know that with perseverance and with work, your brain will grow and you will get smarter. If you have a fixed mindset, you often think that you're just good or bad at something, and really your attitude or your effort don't matter. You can see here that there are, in the white are the examples of fixed mindset kind of comments student might make, and then in the colored, you've got examples of growth mindset. The thing that I find the most fascinating about this is that the new science that has come out has shown us that students' brains physiologically function differently if they have a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset. So what that means in layman's terms is students with a fixed mindset have less ability to learn simply because of their mindset. That's why I think this is so crucial. So we do quite a bit of teaching. There are videos, lots of videos for students on this. Again, in our course, we give you all of these, but you can Google them. They're on YouTube. I like this poster. There's lots of other posters that you could put up that give them language in their own, words that it can help them identify where they are. So whether they have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And most people, 60% of people have a mix of growth and fixed. 20% of people are fixed, 20% of people have a growth mindset. And by the way, in mathematics, we see the most fixed mindset as in subject areas. And this fixed mindset is from adults who aren't even in education to university professors who are mathematics professors, all the way down to kindergarten students. So we want to change that from mathematics being fixed to being growth mindset, because again, the science informs us that we all can learn math to high levels. So I'm going to say that again because a lot of people don't believe me, especially teachers often say, well, no, I'm just not a math person, I'm a language person. We can all learn math to high levels, and it just takes the growth mindset, practice, and perseverance. Part of building that math culture also is about the way we use and think about mistakes. So mistakes, especially in math, because it's often a performance subject, have really been something that students are ashamed of. It's embarrassing, you've made a mistake. But really, mistakes actually help your brain grow. And when we can identify and fix mistakes, we all know this as educators, it's a great opportunity for some growth. But right now, what we often see is students, when they make a mistake or when they're struggling, they give up. And that's really indicative of a fixed mindset. When we see students persevering and embracing mistakes, we know that they have a growth mindset. I always tell my students that without great struggle, you won't have great learning. So when they're frustrated and struggling with something, I celebrate that. And at first they kind of look at me strangely, like, why are you celebrating that I'm frustrated? And I say, because that's where the great learning is about to happen. And I love this poster I found too. So mistakes allow thinking to happen. Another aspect to this, which this isn't really just for the teams, in my opinion, this is just good teaching practice. We need to clearly communicate the learning goals with our students. So making it visual, not just saying it out loud, writing it on the board. What are our goals? So we need to state those, and we also need to tell them that success criteria. That leads back to the co-creating of criteria that I referred to. So that essentially is our success criteria that we've already done. But you might need some more specific criteria around the concept that you're looking at. So really what we're doing here, our goal for these teams is to allow students to learn through problem solving. And in order for that to happen, we need the problem solving to be authentic. And part of this is I love the way that these teams really utilize a mix of discovery learning with some traditional learning as well. So the discovery aspect comes in where we give students a problem that they don't know how to solve yet. That's why it's authentic. So we don't teach them a method and then give them a problem to try out the method. We basically start them with a problem. And the research shows that this primes the brain best for learning that concept. So even though you haven't given them any procedures or any instruction, you give them the problem, you allow them to struggle. And what I was blown away by in these teams was how often the students never needed us to teach them a method. They actually could figure it out on their own. I didn't anticipate that. There were definitely times though where we had to intervene because again, they hadn't been taught a procedure or a method, and that's when we used a little bit of the traditional, the teacher directed. But we always allowed for the focus to be on the process. So they gained all those really important skills, the communicating, the collaborating, the mathematical reasoning, all of that justification. And the other thing we notice with the discovery learning is that failures are embraced and it's just sort of a part of the process rather than failure being a place to shut down and the end of the learning. Part two of when I say authentic problem solving, we need to remember that mathematical problem solving is not just using a procedure to get to an answer. And traditionally, that's what math has been about. It's been primarily focused on calculating, and really students that were quick and could memorize really well were really successful. And those that didn't fit the bill weren't. Now, because the skills that our students are going to need when they leave school are so different from what they were even 20 years ago, we need to incorporate more. And that's what I love about this graphic. So we have attitudes. That's that fixed and growth mindset. So we want to have that attitude of perseverance and the growth mindset. The metacognition we're going to talk about here in a little bit, and that's to do with reflecting on themselves as learners as well as goal setting. The processes are those skills that I've just mentioned again, like the processes of communicating and reasoning and analyzing. And the concepts. Math isn't just a set of rules and a whole bunch of discrete topics. Everything is connected. And when we dig down deep and understand math conceptually, we see all those relationships. And finally, we have our skills. And we can't effectively problem solve without having some math skills. So those are really important as well. Okay, next, I'm going to talk here about choosing the right types of problems. And I always chuckle at this part because this was definitely where I had the most error in my trial and error. Now, I never chose anything this traditional for a number of reasons, but this is sort of an example that is a bit of a, an exaggeration. But I did start with worksheets, and I collaborated with some colleagues, and we created these worksheets, which were really effective in some ways in that they were really focused on looking at the different dimensions. So in this case, we were looking at decimal operations. And so the worksheets really had students using base 10 blocks and number lines and understanding what the actual place value meant, connecting decimal operations with whole number operations and examining why those patterns occur. However, because it was still set up as a worksheet that had, questions 1 through whatever, this is what happened. So students basically were in their teams, but they were working individually. And, really there's no surprise that this happened because we sort of trained our students to do this, especially in math. They, for most of their schooling, math has been the teacher explaining what to do and then the students doing and practicing. And they do that individually most of the time. So we sort of had to untrain them from that and retrain. And the way that we got around that using those sheets, because we did find a lot of value in those sheets. And by the way, I give you all those sheets in the course as well, if you're looking for more detail, is one of the tricks that Dom used was he did not allow them to use their pencil for the first 5 minutes. They just had to talk and discuss their ideas before they started working it out. And when we held them accountable for making sure that not just that they understood, but that their whole team understood, that's that part of complex instruction. So we went and did the check-ins. And when a student couldn't explain how their team had got a solution, then we let the team know that you haven't done your job. And if you're working ahead, if you have one team member that's on question 6 and the rest of them are on question 3, they're also not meeting our expectations because they are meant to be working collaboratively through the problems. And again, I think part of it was students were really wanting to just complete the worksheet. They didn't want homework, or they thought we were going to give them the sheet for homework, which we didn't. and they're so used to just trying to complete it quickly rather than think deeply and looking for multiple representations. So after that experience, I tried in another classroom something totally different. And I found this task. I love Dan Mayer's blog, and he has a bunch of these tasks on there. And why I like them is because they're vague and they don't even give the students enough information yet. By the way, all the information they will need and you will need is on there. It's just not given right away. So you can see here, this question is simply this. There's a coupon for $20 off, a coupon for 20% off, and the question is, which coupon should I use? So that's why I like that problem, is right away the students, it's authentic because it's a problem. They're like, well, I don't know, it depends, which shows me that they actually have already some understanding of percentage. So when we think about the problems, we want to make sure that they are challenging enough that they won't solve it in a few minutes. So if they're just practicing something that you've given them, a procedure, then it's not going to be, that's not really what we're talking about here. So this is the problem that would allow them to explore a concept before you've given them the method. We want to make sure that the problem allows for multiple perspectives, approaches, and representations, and maybe even multiple right answers. I like those open or differentiated tasks, is what I call them on Educating Now. Marion Small calls them open problems. Joe Bowler calls them low floor, high ceiling tasks. They're basically those tasks that even really struggling learners can access them, but also students that maybe even are gifted can still access them and just go way further with them. So they're a problem that are differentiated. And students must engage in their math reasoning skills to solve. So again, we're not giving them a rule and then just giving them problems to apply the rule to. They're trying to create that procedure or rule. So the first thing that, if we go back to that $20 or 20% off thing, the first thing that we do is ask them to make a prediction. So it's really important that students estimate. And again, that's a huge part of our curriculum. Interestingly, if you don't know this already, the part of the brain where a student makes a prediction or an estimate is a completely different part of the brain than the brain that's utilized to actually follow a procedure. So it's really important that we're engaging as much as possible. So students make a prediction, and then they determine what further information, if any, they need. So back to the coupon question, we would have students would say, well, we need to know what the price of the item is. Great. So already they're understanding that percentage is proportional, right? It depends. And by the way, in this class, most of them came up with, they knew that the $100 mark was sort of the magic number, because 20% of 100 is $20. So they knew that that was the value of the item where things would change. So a lot of them predicted if the item costs more than $100, then you would want to use the 20% off coupon. And if it was less, then you would want to use the $20. And I said, great, that sounds wonderful. Now prove it. So part of what I'm doing here is I actually use this task as a diagnostic, which means I'm looking to find out what my students know about percentages. This was a grade 8 class, and so they had learned how to find percentages and numbers in grade 7, and I wanted to see how many of them had remembered that and how well they actually understood the concept. So this was sort of our first task on percentages, and I was using it as a way to gauge where they were at so that we knew where to go in future lessons, how much learning we had to do, or reviewing we had to do before we could go on to new learning. So I asked them to, make those generalizations about their prediction and use what they know to try and solve. Now, I'm going to pause here. As they were making those predictions and going and having those discussions about the generalizations, about percentages, this is the time where you need to be highlighting, I call it the good stuff. So this again is part of that, the complex instruction, and this is something that when I didn't do it in classes, or we didn't do it, it wasn't nearly as successful as when we did. I had a very hard time with this because I kept forgetting to stop them every 5, 7, 10 minutes. So we ended up using a timer, which really helped. And what we're doing is we're checking in with students to reflect on their group learning process. And we do this a lot for the first few lessons, and it totally depends on the class. Sometimes you will need to do this for weeks. Other times you only need to do it for a couple of lessons. But what we're doing here is we're giving them essentially exemplars. So we're looking for when they are doing the right thing. I don't highlight the negative examples, just the positive. And what that does is it shows them what we're looking for. So some examples, if I see a team that's actually physically huddling together, I always will call them out. So I'll say, this team over here showed that they were involving everyone in the process. I could see from across the room that every single person in the team was involved. Every time I hear a student ask for help or say, oh, I don't get that, I always give them a special shout out, because that takes a whole lot of courage. And I say that in front of the class. I say, this takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable in front of your peers and to say, you know what, I need you to stop there because I don't understand what you're talking about. And so I always highlight that when I hear it. And we really need to understand what we're asking our students to do. We're asking them to be very vulnerable. And by the way, I've been saying to my colleagues who are trying this, who also are feeling very vulnerable, because this is a totally new way of teaching for them, and they're very uncomfortable with it because it's a change. And I say, yes, but what great role modeling, because we're asking our students to be vulnerable and to try new things. And we, I think, need to model that. And this is one of the ways you do that, by trying something new. And it's not always going to work out really well every single class, but you will definitely see a huge improvement as you go on. But following through with these specific things that I'm mentioning, for me, is what made the difference between not really working that well and working like gangbusters. Now, also, I will say at this point, many teachers start kind of freaking out because it feels like the whole process is going extremely slowly, and students are not spending a whole lot of time working on the math. They're spending a lot of time on the group process. That is temporary and it's deliberate. So the math must take a back seat for at least a few weeks until they get this group process. I call it gelling as a team. But I will promise you, you will make up that time and then some. I was astounded by how quickly it changed and how quickly students were working through the problems in a multidimensional way and having deep understanding of the concept. That's why I spent my summer creating this course, was because this whole process completely surpassed my expectations, and I've never seen children who were struggling learners make such leaps and bounds in their achievement in such a short period of time. It absolutely astounded me. So we highlight those positive examples. Now we're going to revisit the problem. So we started off with, which coupon do I use? And part of the next part of his Dan Mayer's blog is he gives you a bunch of pictures of different items and their price. So some of them are very inexpensive. There's some small toys, and then you get some quite expensive items. I started with this one with that grade 8 class. I said, okay, the chair's about $140. How much, or what would be the better deal? 20% off or $20 off? Most of the students said 20%, and I said, great, prove it. So I asked them to solve it in as many ways. I even gave them hundreds grids, hoping that that would, you know, remind them that there is a model that they could use. And I walked around as they were starting to do this, and they were trying a whole bunch of different things. I discovered that only one student tried the kind of, I would call it the traditional method of turning the 20% into a decimal and multiplying by the price of the chair. And I said, great, now what made you decide to do that? And she said, oh, I remembered it from last year. I said, great, why does it work? She had no idea. She couldn't even explain to me that 20% was 2/10 as a decimal. This is actually what most of the students did. So it was interesting that they knew to turn it into a decimal, but they were dividing. And this is when I knew it was time for me to intervene, because in the entire class, there wasn't a single person who could model a solution. I knew I needed to intervene. Had there been even one team or one student that could solve this and could explain why, I would have had them come up and explain, but I didn't have that. I will, however, say that I viewed this as a success. Student, and she was one of many that came up and said, oh, I tried this and this is what I got, and I know it's wrong because it makes no sense given the problem. And one of my biggest frustrations and pet peeves really is I see students all the time that are, doing math. They're just calculating and they're not actually thinking about the math. They're just performing operations and they're not looking to see, does this make sense? Is this reasonable? And it drives me nuts because, I know that without that conceptual understanding and checking to see if it's reasonable, it's kind of just a useless exercise. So I loved and I celebrated and I told them that the fact that they knew that their answer was crazy wrong showed me that they are at least paying attention in a number sense and that they know that that's not reasonable. So now I knew that it was time for me to revisit this. We went back through again, the whole class knew that percent meant out of 100. They had this idea. What they didn't know how to do was find the percentage of a value. So I gave them this model to explore. We looked at if this entire large box is the cost of the chair, that's 100%. It's about $140, and I rounded it to that just to make it simpler. How much would 20% be? So we looked at, well, what would each of the small squares be? If the whole big one is 100%, what are the small ones? And because it's visual and they're quite familiar with the 100 grids, a student said, oh, well, each little one is 1%. Great, what would the value of each little square be? And it didn't take long for them back in their teams to figure this out. And there were all sorts of aha moments. As soon as they realized that if 100% of the chair is about $140, that 1% is $1.40, and that they could go from there and figure out anything they needed, any percentage of the chair. Because this was fairly new to them and none of them had seen this model, I wasn't just going to leave it there. So this is what we call teacher agility. So it's knowing when to put aside your original problem and focus on that missing or misremembered skill. So that's what I did. The goal was conceptual understanding. So I wanted to make sure they actually had that conceptual understanding, which is why I used the model. And by the way, if you've never seen visual models or you haven't used manipulatives to look at number concepts like operations with decimals and fractions or even whole numbers, Educating Now, our website, has teacher resource bundles that have video tutorials on how to do all of this, how to use the models, and it gives you resources, lesson plans, everything you'll need to teach math conceptually and meaningfully. So check out our site if you are interested in that as well. So what we did in this class is we did several more examples where we used this model. And then, of course, I asked them, is there more efficient ways of finding percentages of numbers? Because really, we don't want to be having to draw a hundreds grid for every single problem. And I found it interesting that very few students in the class understood that kind of traditional approach of turning it into a decimal and multiplying. Most of them found that the best procedure for them was to take the cost of the item, divide it by 100, and then multiply by whatever percentage they needed, which is essentially what this operation does, but this didn't make sense to them. And that gave me information about their level of understanding, especially the connection between decimals and percentages and what they mean. So we could move further from there and dig into those other misunderstandings. But for now, we return back to the original problem, and they now have the skills. So they can solve for the chair. They proved that yes, 20% was the better deal, and they could solve for different cost of items that were given in the problem set on the blog. And again, we looked for multiple paths, so we wanted to have more than one way. 20% is a great number. Some students realized, wonderfully, that it's a fifth, so they used a fraction to solve. And we looked for as many unique ways of solving as possible, including a visual, which would have been using the grids. And the students really, at the end, all of them had that understanding that, yes, we now believe, we know for sure that anything over $100 using the 20% off is the better deal. I'm going to be coming up to, I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end for question and answering. I haven't heard anything from Luz, so I'm going to assume that there are no questions at this point. But please do, if you have any sort of niggling questions or you want me to repeat something, feel free to ask. So the last real topic here I want to focus on is how this differentiates. So I'm going to start with struggling learners. So for those kids, the biggest thing is, and I think we can all understand this, these students really need one-on-one help. And we know that, and there's no way we can give it to them. One teacher, 30 kids, you do the math, it's just not going to happen unless you use this approach. So this approach gave those kids that help. And I sort of developed a bit of a theory after observing this in multiple classrooms that, you know, and because of the job I do, I mentor in my school, I watch students as they progress from grade 6 to 7 to 8. And students that are struggling in math in grade 6 aren't always still struggling in grade 8. We do a lot of different interventions, but some do. And there was one boy in particular in the grade 8 class, and I had worked with him since grade 6, and he had been struggling since then. And I think part of it is that these struggling learners are the ones that are opting out. They're the ones that pretend to be paying attention that aren't. And so they just continue to fall further behind. And because this method doesn't allow for that, this is the student that, I mean, I can't even believe how quickly he improved and how well he was able to participate given the skills that he had were so much lower than his peers. And this is like, him alone is what made me realize this is so powerful, but he was one of many that I saw such great improvements in. They're constantly supported and encouraged and taught by their peers. And the other thing the teachers noticed was that after they started using these teams in math, the positive effects filtered out into the other curricular areas because the kids were still in the same class. They were still working together. And we end up with these classes that were amazingly supportive and encouraging. And they would celebrate differences. And even the most struggling learners had something that they could contribute. And by the way, oftentimes, they were the ones that understood the concept visually. So they got to be the experts at representing it visually, while their peers might be the expert at representing it procedurally. So almost every student had a place to shine and could be, you know, the smart one, so to speak. So it was really powerful. They can't opt out also because they all have a role to play. They have a job, and each person in the group is responsible for each other's learning. So their peers don't let them opt out because they know that I'm going to come around and ask that person to explain the solution. And when they can't, I let the group know, sorry, you haven't done your job. Even students that have significant learning difficulties can participate in this. And they will be, you'll have to adapt what your expectations are for them in terms of they might not be able to perform the sophisticated procedures that their peers are, but they absolutely can be a part of this, and I think should be a part of it because they deserve the opportunity to develop their critical thinking skills and their higher order thinking skills as well. Now, I will tell you that before I started this, my main concern was actually for those quote unquote strong students. I didn't want them to be in the role of helper. I thought, well, it's not really fair to them. I want them to be challenged mathematically. And I couldn't have been more wrong. They were challenged. And I explained at the beginning the story about Olivia, and that's what I saw throughout. Those students that were quote unquote strong often are very strong procedurally, but they often don't have deep conceptual understanding. And so it's a very big challenge for them to solve the problem in multiple ways, especially visual ways. And when they are in a position where they have to try to explain the concept to their peer, and the peer isn't understanding them, they have to try it in multiple ways. So they were very challenged, and they developed way deeper conceptual understanding. And all the students in between were also challenged and, you know, adequately involved, and everyone really was just having way more of their needs met than I've ever seen before. And this brings me to, I love this image. It's that whole idea that, you know, to be fair doesn't mean that we're going to do the same. So each of our students needs something different, And as you can see here, sometimes they need doubling up on the scaffolding that we do for them. And sometimes they don't need any scaffolding at all. And what I saw was using those teams really did that for the students, because the ones that needed the constant help and the one-on-one were getting it, and the ones that didn't need that kind of help but wanted to explore it in other ways or look at it from multiple perspectives were able to do that and expected to do that. Okay, so summing it all up here, we've got, this is kind of just a summary of what we talked about here. Students are engaged. I've never seen such engagement in a class. It just quite literally blew my mind. The positive peer pressure was in play to help motivate them to continue engaging and learning. We all know as teachers that success breeds success, right? And when students are able to get that support and the explanations they need throughout the whole class, more learning happens. Students are also, when we use these teams, are learning really important life skills like communication, collaboration, problem solving at the same time as learning the math concepts. So you're getting, you know, the best bang for your buck and using that time really, really wisely when we incorporate these things together. And we talked about using challenging problems that can be solved in multiple ways, and that you as the teacher will intervene when needed. It was not all just inquiry. There were many times where we stepped in, we guided whole class discussions, we challenged you know, certain ideas or misrepresentations, and you know, we did do some teacher-directed teaching as well. And the other thing is that from the experience I've seen in multiple classrooms, this way of teaching meets way more of the students' needs. It's the best way to differentiate. And I've really been exploring how to differentiate math for 9 years. And that's why, and that's how Educating Now came about, is it's how we differentiate by using manipulatives, by engaging in structured partner talk, by using differentiated tasks. All of these ways are still utilized, but now within the teams, it's the best of all of it, and it worked so well. If you enjoyed this webinar, please like us on Facebook. We're trying to get the word out about teaching math for meaning, teaching conceptually, and we have so many resources that teachers are using and finding incredibly valuable on Educating Now. So if you haven't looked at our site, please check it out and see what we have. We've had teachers who have never taught math before use our site and are able to teach it really well and feel confident in their own abilities just by using the video library and the resources and the other supports that we have in place. So please share with other teachers. And this is our last webinar on the collaborative teams, but we will be doing more webinars on math instruction. So share the word. I'm Nikki Lynham on Twitter. And feel free to send me a message, an email. You can find my email address on our website, Educating Now. I'm happy to answer questions or discuss more about math education. Tomorrow you will be getting a link with the playback from this webinar, and on that we are offering you 25% off the original price of the collaborative learning course. So I've been talking about this throughout the entire webinar, and this is again the way more detailed version of what I just gave you. So it goes into great depth about everything. The idea is that once you take this course, you'll have everything you need to get your teams up and running in your own classrooms. So with this code, you would click on the enroll in the course, and you can see it's regularly $249. We're offering it to you for $186.75, and that's Canadian. It will land you on a page that looks like this. You create your account, your username, and then you have your payment. And that's it. You will then be enrolled. And the course you can take, you know, it's not like a university course. You can go at your own pace. The information is there for you, and you have access to it forever. It's video tutorials along with resources, lesson plans. There's the diagnostic, there's a poster in there, there's all sorts of goodies in there that will help you use these teams. Here is the lineup. There's actually one more added on since we took this screenshot. We have a formative assessment component in there now. And you can see that we go through a lot of the aspects. There's a whole lecture just on the first week with the teams, because that week is often very different from the weeks that follow. And I should also mention too that the course is interactive. So there's other teachers that are up and using this already, and they're posting comments, and you can do questions and comments. It acts as a forum so that we can support each other as educators in our classrooms. So at this point, I'm going to see if there are any questions from you guys. Anything, Lou?
No questions right now.
Okay, great. So if you've had a chance to look this over and you do have some questions afterwards, I know sometimes they don't pop into your brain right away, please feel free to email me. And again, you can find my email. I'm Nikki@educatingnow.com, and you can find it on the website as well. So thanks for joining us today, and I hope that you are feeling inspired to give this a go in your own classrooms. Like I said, I did a kickoff with 2 classrooms today, 3 classrooms actually. We combined 2 classes and did a big group for the first lesson, and then I was in a French immersion class, and it's really amazing to watch the kids engage with this. They love learning about the growth mindset, especially. That's where we're at today, and we're going to move into, you know, those 4 C's. So take a look at the collaborative learning course, and the lesson plans, easy to use. Teachers all over my building are using it and finding success already. Thanks for joining us, and again, share and like us on Facebook and Twitter.